Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. Do you remember the experiment you probably tried as a kid, where you connected two tin cans with a piece of string and spoke into it so the other person could hear it with the vibrations going down the string? Yeah, it never worked for me either. But the point is, the true breakthrough in modern communications was when this tin can to tin can approach involved a third tin can. That's just an example to help visualize the importance of today's topic, the creation of the telephone switchboard here in Connecticut. Our guest today is Jason Bischoff-Wurstle. He's the director of photo archives at the New Haven Museum. And wait until you hear the story he tells about how the switchboard came into being in the city of New Haven. This week's trivia question: what do the words Connecticut and Housatonic mean? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. Yale New Haven Hospital was the very first hospital in Connecticut. They opened their doors 200 years ago and later introduced the entire country to the use of penicillin and chemotherapy. Today, some of the brightest minds in medicine choose to work there, and it's the primary teaching hospital for the prestigious Yale School of Medicine. For more information, log on to ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. If you're old enough, you may just remember when the great actress Lily Tomlin was early on in her career. She used to play a switchboard operator, and she'd have these pretend conversations as she connected calls, and it really helped propel her fame and fortune. Well, Lily and the rest of us can thank a guy named George Willard Coy for making the telephone switchboard a reality. Now, nobody is taking anything away from Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, but it also has to be said that just like any other invention, follow-up improvements to the base idea sometimes have an outsized influence. Well, because until Coy came along, the phone was just a way for two people to speak with each other without having to write a letter or travel to the other person's location. Now, that was important too. Like I said, no disrespect meant on the invention of the telephone. Rather, it's just to help put into context how important the invention of the telephone switchboard really was. And this all happened right here in Connecticut in New Haven. And here today to tell us this incredible backstory is the director of the Photo Archives Collection at the New Haven Museum, a true student of history himself, Jason Bischoff-Wurstle. Jason, in the late 1800s in this country, there were technology advancements moving along that were very similar in different ways, perhaps, but very similar to when the internet came around in the late 1900s. I mean, suddenly we were able to have electricity and photography and motion pictures, and the telegraph being replaced by something called the telephone. So it was kind of an exciting time to be alive and for things to happen. And in the midst of this comes a guy moving to New Haven from the state of Maine, a gentleman named George Willard Coy, who's going to end up playing a pretty big role in this. And I was wondering, let's start off, could you tell me a little bit about George Coy? I know he was born in Maine and did the Civil War service. What can you tell us about him after that?
George Willard Coy grew up and came from Freedom, Maine. Served in the Civil War, where his arm was fractured, and while recuperating in a veterans hospital, he studied the art of using the telegraph. So he took a job with the Atlantic and Pacific Telegraph Company, and that brought him to New Haven. That's really where the story begins, the first commercial telephone switchboard, because his interest naturally in the telegraph and modern tech at that point, paired with the entrepreneurial spirit and new tech that was developed in telephones, kind of brought us to where we are today. It was that big of a deal.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, and to put a year on this, it was 1876 when the patent was issued to Alexander Graham Bell for the telephone. And I guess Bell himself then came to New Haven and was doing a lecture. Can you fill in that part of the story?
The story here starts with the switch to the telephone was April of 1877. So about a year later, give or take, Bell is, kind of doing a tour. He's getting out there, he's showing off the telephone, and he's trying to build his business. This is America. And you build something, you might owe somebody money for the actual investment they put into helping you invent something, or, you're trying to market it. He came here and he'd set up an exhibition, basically. And he was giving a talk at Skiff's Opera House here in New Haven, kind of like the Apple presentations. They borrow a lot from these old type displays. Bell's giving this talk, and then he gets on a three-way phone call. And the phone call goes from New Haven to Hartford to Middletown, Connecticut. At each stop, people picked up and there was a conversation. And in the audience was Willard Coy. And this is blowing his mind. Right there, he's like, whoa, I can't believe this. And he leaves that presentation and goes to obtain a franchise of the Bell Telephone Company. Something of note would be that phone call being three-way meant that each thing was most likely, it's not, we don't have it 100% confirmed, but the way the tech worked at that point was they were directly lined, meaning from New Haven, that was one direct line that was running all the way to Hartford. And then that direct line was running all the way to Middletown and back. So it was one direct loop rather than what became the system of telephone lines and wires. And now today would be, obviously satellite and what have you.
So this was not the first party line.
No, and that sort of came about through the switchboard that Coy developed.
He gets then the franchise for New Haven and Middlesex counties for the Bell telephone system, and gets, I guess, a building called the Boardman Building on State Street, and from what I understand, used some pretty ingenious parts to go ahead and start building a switchboard.
Yeah, exactly. So he sets up his franchise with the company. He's in the Boardman Building here in New Haven, but he'd set up in a very small kind of shop office, very bare bones, scrapped together $600 to build this prototype that he designed. We're talking cutting-edge technology at that point. The telephone itself had only been patented for 2 years, even less than 2 years at this point. It's very new. As with anything that's new in that regard, you don't have, say, the parts. You don't have the telephone guy. The telephone guy is Bell. And he's sitting there trying to figure out, okay, cool, I came up with this idea and this works, and how can I change this? How can I make this better? So Coy, he draws up this idea, this design to have the switchboard, and he uses different parts that he scrapped together, such as teapot lids, extra parts from carriages, and wiring that he took from his wife's undergarments. Pieces together on a pretty simple wood board, and it worked. It came together and it worked, and it established that you could have this switchboard where different lines came in and an operator would switch the lines. So you could actually use it instead of, because up to that point, telephones were only direct lines with each other. I mean, like, for instance, if you and I wanted to have a conversation, we'd both have to buy a phone and we'd have to run a line between our homes or our businesses, and then only you and I could talk to each other. So for like a business, that's practical to some degree to speed up the communication, but anybody else, it's like, well, you only want to talk to that person. You might as well just get in your carriage or ride your horse, or, chances are in a small town or a small city, you could literally just walk down the street and speak to that person. So what this did was commercialize and speed up and create an easier necessity for the use of the telephone.
And communications and transportation are two of the key linchpins for development of society anywhere in the world, and this is why this is so significant. And the other part I find fascinating about this is, so his lecture, when Bell comes to New Haven, is April of 1877, and in less than a year, at the end of January 1878, Coy is ready to launch his new device, right? Do I have that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. By January 28th, 1878. So, yeah, in less than a year, he had attained the franchise and he designed and got this board up and running. So he was moving ahead very, very fast. He established a district telephone company. So the actual patent for the board came through 2 years later in February of 1880. But the company was up and it was running. And this was in January. And so by February of 1878, the world's first phone directory came out. The significance of this is, like, what I like to say to people is, like, okay, you open your phone today and there's Google, what have you, whatever search engine you're using. This is the basis for that. This one page of paper that had a list of names, and these were the first subscribers to the district telephone company. And they were locally in New Haven. They were a group of businesses and generally people with money. It was generally more wealth-based luxury at that point. But these were people that had subscribed to the service and would have a phone installed in their home, and the line would run from their house or their business and then connect to these other new lines, because with each growing subscriber, it would create a need to run new lines, put up new poles, etc., and expand the network. And this ran back to the Boardman building, and there would be an operator there that would switch and be able to take phone calls around the clock. And this cost, at the time, the monthly subscription cost $1.50, which, today sounds like a great deal. $1.50 would have been, not a ton, but a good amount of money. It was also the equivalent, when you're speaking of transportation, it was the same cost of an overnight trip from New Haven to New York on a steamboat. That, previous to things like the telegraph and the telephone, was the game changer in time, in tech, really, and from my outlook. Earlier in the 19th century, the first ocean-going steamboat trials were completed between New York and New Haven. And what that did was basically take a trip to get to New York, New Haven, or wherever. You had to get your horse, you had to get your wagon, what have you. It would generally take a day to 2 days to get back and forth. Now you're doing that in less than 12 hours. But the telephone was like next giant boom. As you had mentioned, it's kind of similar to the internet. It's just that giant boom.
The other thing that is kind of interesting to look at is it's easy today to look back and say, well, it was a modest, humble beginning with just 21 subscribers. That was 21 people that he managed to put together in a subscription basis. And then a month later, it had already jumped up to 50. And that's when he said, wow, I'm going to need this directory. And we're going to get back to that in a second. But I just wanted to point out that within 9 months, he had 341 subscribers, which is just a phenomenal growth platform. It's amazing to see. Anyway, let's get back to the directory for a second, because I wanted to go through some of these 50. And as you said, there were some businesses on there, some residents. One thing I found very interesting was that we didn't have the car yet when you talk about technology. So they had some hack and boarding stables, two of them, which would be like calling up a cab or Uber today.
Exactly. Yep. That's a great point. And especially, again, when I mentioned this was more of a luxury item, the people that could afford to say, hey, get my carriage ready, or just have a carriage arrive. The development of the telephone, the communication, that seemingly instantaneous traveling of news and your voice even, that this is yet another thing where the ripple effect would be the development of the car. Well, at the same time, electricity is starting to spread. Electricity was, again, something that was only in large mansions and people that can afford it. Electricity would then start becoming cheaper and people would invest in it, and it became more of a public utility, same as phones would eventually become commonplace.
Going back to this directory for just 1/2 second longer. So there were 11 individual residences, 20 stores or factories, a couple doctors and dentists, and the cabs that we talked about. But two particular ones I wanted to ask you about, the Mercantile Club and the Quinnipiac Club. Can you tell me about those two and what they were?
These were the movers and shakers, the local movers and shakers around town, bankers, business people, developers. If you were a who's who in New Haven, you were members of these clubs. Another thing on the list that's funny is half the residences are actually the people who were the company, and they listed themselves because, why not?
That's a good point, too. The 341 subscribers, when they got up there, they ended up with a 40-page directory, which was really, I guess, the first version of what might look like the white pages, because the single-page directory was interesting because there were no phone numbers, because there didn't have to be phone numbers.
Exactly. It was just the people on that list. And so you pick up the phone, the operator picks up and says, "Oh, hello, Mr. blah, blah, blah." Okay, yeah, I can connect you to them. And it was just very small. Numbers have changed, even throughout our lifetimes, have changed often. And I can clearly remember when 860 was a big deal. It's like, oh, whoa, we're getting another area code in Connecticut? And now I have no idea what it was a thing before where you're like, oh, that's your area code. You knew where people resided. And now everybody with cell phones from all over the place. I don't keep track of area codes. Let's put it that way. I'm sure there are people out there that do, though.
Well, I'm with you, though. When 860 came in, it was like a sort of a seismic feel to it. It was a big, big change. 1882, Coy's company becomes something that I think a lot of Connecticut residents remember, the Southern New England Telephone Company.
Yes, this is the beginning of that. And by this point, Coy was not as much involved. It developed from the district to the Connecticut Telephone Company and then became the Southern New England Telephone Company. And this 4 years, they now covered all of Connecticut and Western Massachusetts. So again, speaking to that growth, all of Connecticut, not just a couple houses and businesses in New Haven in 4 years. Part of that growth had been facilitated because they had been briefly heavily invested by the large capitalist of the day, one of the large capitalists and financiers, Jay Gould, who ultimately was trying to control Western Union. By investing in this company and kind of controlling it, it was sort of a ploy on his end. And Coy and Herrick Frost, who was one of his partners, they didn't like this direction. This was very brief, and they got control of the company back. Brief meaning probably under a year. But that injection of today, what would be like corporate investment into a startup, helped them grow rapidly. And keep in mind, too, with this growth, the lines weren't there. So they were responsible, too, in putting up all the lines. So they started hiring all the linemen and people who would install poles and what have you, and spreading this across lower New England, hence southern New England and the telephone.
So the next time that one newfangled invention, your car, runs into the other newfangled invention, the telephone pole, you can thank George Willard Coy. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. You know, the building in New Haven where that first telephone switchboard was built and operated hasn't survived quite as well as the telephone itself. In fact, the building was torn down in the 1970s in the name of urban renewal. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Jason Bischoff-Wurstle. He's the director of photo archives at the New Haven Museum and a great teller of this story. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, what do the words Connecticut and Housatonic mean? Well, Connecticut means long tidal river, and Housatonic means a place beyond the mountain. They are both originally Native American terms which European settlers adopted and have clearly stood the test of time. We're still using them. Well, next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to have an episode focusing on Native Americans in the western part of the state, and they had a decidedly different experience and history than the Native Americans in eastern Connecticut, and we'll take a look at that in a future episode. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and please stay healthy.